Anita, you love to read. Do you have a favorite book that inspired you?
Oh my word, there's been so many. And every new book I read, I think this is the most wonderful book I've ever read. And for about 30 years, all I read was spiritual books in the Bible. The Lord just stopped me reading anything else. And then my daughter bought me an autobiography for Christmas about 5 or 6 years ago. And I absolutely gobbled up the pages. And I felt like the Lord said, this is what you can read because it's about real people. It's not those, those stories you read that make you cry and make you sad, and then it's not even about real people. So I started reading autobiographies. I don't read biographies because it's not about the person; it's about somebody following their story. So if I can tell you the most wonderful book I read, of course, was the very first one, which was David Beckham's life story. And it's a big, thick book, glossy book my daughter bought me, and I absolutely loved it. And of course, I'd been praying for David Beckham, the soccer player, for years, not even knowing who he'd be and how famous he would become and so on. So that was almost a prayer assignment. And then the other two that really made an impact on me was Agatha Christie's life story, the most interesting woman, because I wrote books, as you know, and how I developed my books is one story, but how she developed her books was absolutely fascinating. She traveled all over the world with a funny little old typewriter, and she never had an office. She used to just prop it up wherever she was, on a dresser, on her knees, on a bed, and she would go into this fantasy world of her, crime novels, which I've never read any of them. Of course, we all saw the movies. Alfred Hitchcock always did them there. They were so exciting. But her autobiography was fantastic. And then the other one I read was that also made a huge impact on me because it was so beautifully written. And right at the end, they tell you who helped, who was the ghostwriter. And the ghostwriter was a Nobel Prize literature person. I don't even remember his name. So that's why the book was so beautifully written. And it was Andre Agassi, the tennis player, and his whole life story, and how he had problems with his hair and the funny things that bother people that you never know about. We always thought he was so cool because he had the long hair and the bandana, but it was all a wig. And one day he just took the wig off and he said, that's it, no more wig. And honestly, it was so honest and so beautiful. And the way it all evolved, and the marvelous people he met and the mentors he had, it just blessed me. To me, these autobiographies are almost like the apostolic prophetic ministry. You have these managers and these coaches, I've read their books too, of different sports, and they almost have an apostolic calling, but they're doing it with a soccer team or a rugby team or, a tennis player, which of course tennis players play alone. So it's very hard for them. And they're not all loners. Some of them are actually people, but they end up in that career. So for me, those autobiographies have made a huge impact. And of course, one of the very first spiritual books, I suppose I better mention that made a big impact on me was the Elijah Task, because all the things I dreamed were in the book. All the words God gave me were in this book. It was such a confirming book to read, that also a big thick book, but I just gobbled up the pages because I do love to read. But of course, keeping up my reading habit, I'm always buying books all over the place, and then I stack them up. And I even belong to the digital library in Hertfordshire, believe it or not, England. Because I'm a UK citizen, I went to the library and I joined, and I get all the digital books. So, you know, just everywhere you find books, secondhand books, new books, anything that's new, you know, I read. I just love to read about people. People have always fascinated me. So long answer, but there you go.
When did you start writing your first manual? Were you involved in a lot of ministry before you started, or how did that process take place?
Well, I'll give you that answer, but I'll first have to give you this one. I went to a conference in my, pre-ministry years, which were not 5 minutes. It was a few years. With, doing little basic things. I went to a conference in Durban, and it was all prophets. They were all prophets speaking at the conference, but they were all from America. And there was, I don't know if you remember Kim Clements. He was doing the music. It was in that church. That's how I knew about it. We used to go on holiday every year to Durban, and he was part of this Durban church. And I'd seen him on Sundays in the pulpit singing, prophesying. He was just awesome. It was actually Durban Christian Center. And he was absolutely my favorite musician. He could sing, and it was just so, sing the song of the Lord, and he had such freedom. He played the piano, and they gave him such freedom in the worship, and I absolutely loved it. So when they said there's a conference coming, I thought, I've just got to get there. 3 small kids, a husband, the whole lot, I've just got to go. So I made a plan, and I got some people from my local church, one where that wonderful pastor was, and I went off, and this was before I even went to Bible school. And off I went to, actually it was after Bible school. Sorry, I've got the years. I don't always get the years right. I've got to go through all my diaries to get the proper years. But it was just after Bible school. I went with a group from my church, and off we went to this wonderful conference in Durban. It was just fabulous. And all I remember them speaking about was training. You must get training. Every speaker that came up spoke about training. You have to get training. You must get training. I thought, how am I ever going to get training? I'll get the message, but where? And I went into the foyer, and I got the brochure that they had in the foyer of all the speakers for the event, which of course I had back at the cottage where we were staying, but I didn't have it with me. But I knew I must go and look, where are they all from? And I knew Kim Clements is in Durban, and this one's here and that one's there. How am I going to do this? So I got the brochure, and on the back of the brochure was this one prophet that lived in South Africa, Ed Trout. And I thought, well, I'll write him a letter and ask him, where must I get training? How can I do it? That's all I wanted to know was how I've been to this conference now. I'll get the message, and I must get training. And I waited, I think, 3 months before I got a reply. In those days, it was post. And I got a letter in the post, and he told me, he said, it's wonderful that you want training. I'm so blessed to hear that. I have a group in Pretoria, because he was in Cape Town. He wasn't even in, he was in South Africa, but not in where I was living in Pretoria. And he said, there's a prayer group in Pretoria that meet on a Saturday night. And I thought, a Saturday night's the worst night. It's the only night everybody's home. My husband, they don't have dinner at the hotel where he works, his business. The children are home. We sit and watch a movie, but I've got to go. It's only once a month, and I've just got to make this sacrifice. Of course, the family didn't mind. They were watching movies with Dad, and their dad always got them takeaways when Mom wasn't around. So they were thrilled. They got hamburgers from the burger den next door, and I would go off to these Saturday meetings, and the Lord would just give me these words. And the people would they'd stand in the middle and pray. There was only a small group of about 8 or 10 people part of this group, but people would come from far and near to have prayer in this prayer meeting. And everybody else would get these wonderful words of, you're a blessing and you're wonderful. They'd sit somebody on a chair in the middle, and everyone would say, you're so special, the Lord loves you. And I'd stand there and I'd think, I'm not getting that at all. But how am I ever going to share this word that's completely different to everyone else's? And then they'd say to me, Anita, have you got something? Like we all do. And I'd say, well, I have, but it doesn't fit. And they'd say, no, go ahead and say it. And then I'd say something like, your marriage needs work, your children feel neglected, all this stuff. And I think, oh my word, I'm such a horrible person. How could I say? And the person with usually, I remember very first one was a man. And I remember him sitting there and he opened his eyes and he looked up at me and he burst into tears and he started to cry inconsolably. And he said, it's all true. It's all true. And I thought, wow, feedback immediately. I'm so happy. And everybody said, well done, Anita. And then the same would happen the next time I went. And the same. So that was really very, very slowly I started. And then this Prophet Ed Trout came up. He'd come up every 6 months or so to this meeting and be part of the meeting. And we were in this venue and there weren't a lot of people, because it was this team and the team's wives and one or two invited guests, maybe 30 or 40 people. And straight away he picked me out and he said to me, who are you? So I said, Anita Giovannoni. So I said, oh, you wrote me the letter. He says, without a shadow of a doubt, the Lord says you're a prophet. And this is what you're going to do. And he went into this long prophetic word. And while he was talking, I was thinking, this is the most wonderful experience. I'm so blessed. My heart was jumping. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I was so excited that I got this wonderful prophecy. And I got this from the senior prophet. And now we're learning from this prayer group how to use your gift. So I said, now, when we have meetings, I want all of you there. You have to be if I'm in Pretoria or Joburg, or anywhere near and you can get to the meeting, you have to get there. So, of course, that's what we started to do. This group of people, we used to go to the meeting where he was ministering and in our own cars, and then, of course, he'd minister and then he'd call us up and he'd say, Anita, I'll see you at the back there. Come to the front, Marius. You know, Marius, different people. Harry, come to the front. A few people call us up. And the others he'd prophesy a word and then he'd say, call somebody up and he'd say, now we're going to prophesy over this lady. And he'd hand the microphone to the person next to him and the person next to him would say, I've got nothing. And the person next to him, he'd hand the microphone and say, I've also got nothing. And 3 or 4 of them would have nothing. And, of course, I was the only woman in the group, so I was right at the end, the last in the row. And I would say, I've got to have something. This person's there in the front waiting for a nice word, and everybody's got nothing. And I'd say, Lord, you've just got to give me something. And I'd just open my mouth. I promise you, I'd have nothing. And I'd open my mouth and the Lord would just give me something to say. Just like the Bible says, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. And I've done that ever since the beginning, that I know if the Lord wants to speak to that person, he will give me a word for them because it's about them. It's not about me getting a word and impressing the crowd, because people forget you. They don't even remember who you are that gave the word, but they will remember the word. So that was really how I started. Very scary, very nervously, but very excited after every prophetic word. I couldn't sleep. I was absolutely thrilled. I would dissect it and say, oh, I hope it was right, Lord, because, people take your word, as if God is speaking, which, of course, we believe it's the Holy Spirit, but people really, so you've got to be as accurate as possible. So that was been my prayer, the whole, nearly 40 years I did this, that I would be accurate, that I wouldn't make mistakes, that I would rather shut up. Even while I'm prophesying, if it's over, I just stop. I don't add to it and repeat and do all that, because that's when you make mistakes. So short, sharp, and sweet. Doesn't have to be long. Doesn't have to be miles and miles of prophetic word. It must make an impact. And it must be the truth, what God is saying.
Absolutely, I agree. So how did you then transition into writing your manuals or starting to teach from there? Were you part of a ministry team for a while with Ed Trout before you eventually ventured onto your own?
Yeah, I was in the ministry team with him for a long time, 5 or 7 years, and he arranged for me to go to Bill Hammond's prophetic training. So I told my husband, I said, before I even knew, I could go to Bill Hammond, that Ed Trout was on his board. I said to my husband, I've read out Ed Trout's book, and he mentioned this training school. And the minute I read it, I knew immediately, because I used to buy all the books. I love to read. So anytime there was a guest speaker or a visitor, I'd buy all the books and tapes if there were any. And I'd read everything, listen to everything. And of course, I read Ed Trout's training book. And in the book, he said, we have a school in Santa Rosa Beach in Florida every 6 months. And I knew, how you just know, I've got to get there. I've got to get to this school. I've got to get this training from this marvelous, fabulous Bill Hammond, who I've admired and watched and looked at. I've got to go. So I said to my husband, I'm going to America to Bill Hammond's Bible School. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I'm going. Of course, remember, I was a housewife. I had no job. I had a little housekeeping budget, and I thought, the Lord will provide. I've just got to go. I can't miss this. So I mentioned it to Ed Trout. I said to him, I really want to go to, they ask you have these team meetings, and they say, what is your picture vision? What would you like to do with your future? How are you going to? And I said, well, I'm going to Bill Hammond's 2-week training, prophetic training. And he said, and how are you going to do that? I said, I've got no idea. But I'm going to apply and I'm going to go. And I don't know, you've got to get a letter from your pastor and a recommendation. They don't just let anyone in. So he says, well, you don't know this, but I'm on his board. And I will send him a letter and say a word for you so that, recommend you to come. So, I was absolutely thrilled. But anyway, now I've got permission to go. I've even entered in at the Bible school. I know when I'm going, but now I've got to get an American air ticket. How am I ever going to do that? Where will I stay? How will I get there? I didn't know that much about international travel. And I thought, I've got to find, of course, I've been to England backwards and forwards, but I didn't know how to go to America. But of course, traveling in America is extremely easy. Everything's laid on for you. You can have access to everything. And of course, there's no inflation. So for years and years and years, everything stays the same price. It's not like when you go to Europe. You can buy something for £1, and then next time you go, it's £1.30, and then it's £1.50. But in America, if it's $1, it's $1. For 5 years, 10 years, sometimes 15 years. There's just no inflation. I don't know about now, but that I'm talking about then. And I forget the year. I think it was 84, 85 that I went. No, the 85, 86 I went to Bible school. So it must have been about 89, 88, 89. I can't remember. 90. It was in the 90s. I'll get the date and I'll WhatsApp you, Elaine, and then you can put the right date in. And I went off to, I told my husband, and my husband says, well, don't look at me. I'm not paying for the air ticket. How are you going to get there? So I said, I don't know. The Lord will provide. You know how we are. We just believe God with all our hearts. And I really did. I thought, God told me to do this. He's going to provide. And every now and again, my husband would say to me, you're going to America. I don't know how you're going to do that. Then I'd say, well, the Lord will provide. I know that. And then a little while later, he'd say again, are you still going to America? How are you going to do it? And I started to save. I saved from my housekeeping. I saved from, just different, that I'd sell things, I'd save money, and I saved up a little bit, but of course it was nowhere near the cost of an air ticket. And then after about 3 or 4 months, my husband said to me, you know what, I don't want you to go on your own. I don't want to miss out. I think I'll also go. So I said, oh, that'll be wonderful. Then we'll go together. Because now this wonderful prophet Ed Trout arranged for me to stay in somebody's deluxe property right on the beachfront of all the friends he knew in America. So we had 2 weeks free accommodation. We just had to get there and hire a car and, of course, pay for the training. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we ended up going. My husband said to me, okay, I'll buy the air ticket because I also want to go. So reluctantly, he ended up buying me the air ticket. So we both went. And off we went out on this wonderful adventure. We hired a car, and I was so happy he was with me because he absolutely fell in love with America. And of course, Florida is just a delight. It's just beautiful there. And every day I'd go off to the school, spend the whole morning there till 2, 3 in the afternoon. Oh, it was just wonderful. Everything I heard and learned, I already knew, and I was doing in a sort of a very hesitant fashion. But boy, when you go and you see and you learn the way they do things, you just get inspired and your confidence grows. And then when I came home, I said, that's it. I'm doing my own school in my local church. So I asked the pastor, I said to him, I want to do a school. So he said to me, well, we can't do it. He said, we've got a marriage seminar and we've got, music training on a so-and-so Wednesday, and on a Thursday, everyone goes to home cell. And Mondays we do, intercession. He says, there's just no night to do it. So I said to him, but we don't do a marriage seminar. He says, yes, but I'm starting. I've written it all and I'm ready to do it. So, of course, no marriage seminar that term, no marriage seminar the next term. The third term, I said to him, now listen, you haven't, I spoke to him very nicely. I said, you haven't done the marriage seminar. Can I start my prophetic training? And if you want to interrupt it in the middle and start your marriage seminar, then I'll stop. So I handed out a few pamphlets and I, designed me and designing wasn't so hot, but I managed to do a little pamphlet, and I printed them all out, went off to the little printing press and had, 30 or 40 printed on A5s and, hand distributed them to a few people that I knew. And wouldn't you know, the first night when I had the training, the only night I could do it was a Monday night, which was a horrible night to do anything. That's the night people stay home and, wash their hair and do their washing and, meet with their family. And, Monday night's just not a good night. It's just after a weekend of being in church the whole weekend and church picnics and all sorts of stuff, Monday night you just want to be home. But no, I was the only night the pastor would give me, so I took it. Well, I had a big crowd. I think 40 or 50 people turned up. And I had to develop my lectures as I went along. So that was my very first school, teaching my own material. But in order to get the material, I have to backtrack a little bit. When I finished Bible school in 1986, in 1987, it's sort of in the middle of the year, I remember it was cold, so it was winter, a pastor's wife phoned me, and it was one of the people in our church's mom and dad that were pastors of this church. I'd been to the church, but only with him because it was his mom and dad. When he ministered, I was there, just as a support, as one does, as we always did in those days. We went along to support each other. And I didn't know that they knew that I'd been to Bible school. And she said, we want you to come and teach in our Bible school. And she said, we want you to teach on prophecy. So I thought, prophecy? I said, oh, of course, you know what we learned to do, because I'd been in a certain kind of business before. I was Anita, the businesswoman. the lady that I bought my business from, she said, say yes to everything and figure out afterwards how to do it. So that's been my motto all the years. It stands out. Mrs. Belanco, she said to me, say yes to everything and figure out how to do it later. So I said, yes, of course I'll come. And afterwards I thought, now what does she mean? What must I go through all Daniel's prophecies about the end times? What does she mean, prophecy? And I thought, well, I wonder if it's not 1 Corinthians 12, the gifts. So maybe it's that. So I better go and look there. So I went and had a look there, and that was how I developed my teachings. I used to type them. I used to wait on the Lord the whole week and say, Lord, what must I teach on this, and what must I say about that? And my first lecture, I think, was an overview of prophecy, which is actually what I do now. What is in, well, not me anymore, but what the Academy of Prophecy is all about, the overview of prophecy, so that people know what the next few weeks is going to be about. So I prayed and the Lord said, overview of prophecy. So how I get the lecture, I first get the title, so I know that's what it's going to be, and then I start getting the content, and then I get headings for the content. Most of my manuals are all headings. The Lord says, how do you start? Then what? Where do we go now? How do I do it? Do I want to do it? Who do I do it for? All the little headings I've got. And then I fill in the content. Also through prayer and waiting on the Lord. I used to take the whole week. I start on a Monday worrying about this lecture at the Bible school, because now all the students are there thinking they're getting proper stuff, but I'm hearing the Lord, and this is all fresh and new. And that was how I got the very first manual, Flowing Prophetically, which of course later expanded and turned into the first lecture of, the Academy of Prophecy and so on. And I used to type it all out, and then I'd go and lecture on it. And surprisingly, after every meeting, a few people's face would sort of light up, not light up like a candle, but just they would just stand out. I would just know I must prophesy over that person. And by the end of the course, 7 or 8 weeks, I prophesied over everybody. And I was so excited. I thought, this is absolutely wonderful. So basically, the ministry, if you can call it that, it evolved. Then I did this, then I did that, then I thought, but I can do this, but I can do this, but I can teach, because I don't always consider myself a teacher. I know I teach, and I know everyone says, oh, Anita, yes, wonderlik, but I don't really see myself as a teacher. I'm more an exhorter, exhort in all the, the lectures I give. And I've got to be careful not to go on the rabbit trails as I'm going now, so that I stick to the point. So when I'm lecturing, I'm very good at that. I stick to the point because I've got my lecture in front of me. I've also learned that if this is a lecture, I must give a lecture. People don't want to leave this meeting having heard all your stories and not receiving a lecture. They want to learn, because that's why they come to your schools, to learn. So I would really discipline myself and stick to the notes and the lecture and so on. And then from those schools I started on that Monday night, I had to get proper lectures. I had to expand on those. And then I taught on that. And then people would say, what are we going to do next term? And I'd say, well, we'll have to do something. And that's how, I would actually randomly hear the Lord on what to teach. I would teach every week on something completely different. It's not even in the manuals, because I would wait on the Lord, get a revelation, teach on it, do the practicals, do the prophesying, get a few people that, to prophesy over each other, and do all that and get the people activated and motivated. So I've just done that from the very first school, where I was learning myself what works and what doesn't work. And the way it is today and the way you do it, it's borne fruit. And it teaches people how to hear God, how to prophesy. It all still relevant. And each person like you and me and so on, we expand on it. We get our own activations. We get our own additions to the lecture. You know, we get our own thoughts about it because it must be personal. You know, I can't pass everything I know on to anyone. I can only help them develop their gift.